Welcome to Literary Travels with River. Today I bring you an exciting summary of An Offer from a Gentleman by Julia Quinn, the third book in the Bridgerton series. Sophie, a humble young woman mistreated by her stepmother, experiences a magical night when she secretly attends the most important ball in London. There, she captures the heart of Benedict Bridgerton, but her happiness is fleeting as she returns to her harsh reality. Years later, Sophie becomes a servant in Benedict's household, without revealing her true identity. He feels a powerful attraction towards her, but social barriers keep them apart. Can true love overcome these obstacles? Join me as we explore this enchanting story of love and second chances. Prologue. At the vast and elegant Penwood Park, Sophie Beckett was always a mystery, wrapped in the figure of an illegitimate child. Since she appeared one rainy night at the age of 3, everyone knew she was the unacknowledged daughter of the 6th Earl of Penwood, Richard Gunningworth. Despite the obvious physical similarities, no one dared to discuss it, both out of respect for Sophie and fear of losing their jobs. The Earl never spoke of her origin, but he undoubtedly knew she was his daughter, a truth sealed when he burned the letter that accompanied Sophie the night she arrived. Sophie's life at Penwood Park was lonely and full of longing. As a mere child, she accepted her status as a bastard, though without fully understanding its implications. Her days were spent among the servants, with whom she shared deeper bonds than with her own father, whom she saw only on rare occasions. The calm of her existence was shattered when the Earl decided to marry. Sophie hoped that the arrival of a new Countess and her 2 daughters would bring her the company and familial love she so desperately craved. However, reality was cruel. Araminta, the new Countess, and her daughters Rosemund and Posy showed clear hostility towards her from the beginning. Araminta, in particular, never missed an opportunity to remind her of her bastard status, relegating her to a place of contempt and disregard. Despite Sophie's efforts to integrate and find affection in her new family, her life became a series of humiliations and scorn. Rosemund, the elder daughter, enjoyed tormenting her, while Posy, though less cruel, followed her mother's dictates. The Earl, oblivious or indifferent, did not intervene in this dynamic of mistreatment. Sophie's situation worsened when the Earl died unexpectedly, leaving Araminta as the primary authority in the house. The Earls will stipulated that Araminta would receive a considerable sum as long as she cared for Sophie until she turned 20. Although initially reluctant, Araminta's greed prevailed, accepting the condition for the financial reward but with no intention of giving Sophie any dignified treatment. Thus, Sophie was trapped in a life of servitude and sadness, with the constant hope that one day her situation would improve. Her spirit, though battered, was not entirely broken, keeping alive the hope that one day, somehow, she would find the place and love she deserved. First part, Chapter 1. The most anticipated event of the season was about to be held, the Masquerade Ball at the Bridgerton house. All the members of London's high society were excited with the preparations and speculated about who would attend and how they would dress. However, what garnered the most interest were the 2 single Bridgerton brothers. Although they held no noble titles, they were considered some of the best matches of the year, with respectable fortunes and remarkable beauty. Meanwhile, at Penwood House, Rosamund's screams broke the tranquility. Sophie Beckett, the illegitimate daughter of the late Earl, hurried up the stairs to attend to her. Rosemund, demanding and disdainful, constantly asked for hot tea and fresh cookies, and Sophie, submissive, complied with her orders. Despite the unjust treatment, Sophie maintained her dignity and fulfilled her duties, even helping Posy, the younger sister, choose her outfit for the ball. The atmosphere at Penwood House was filled with tension and expectation. Araminta, Sophie's stepmother, and her daughters were preparing to attend the ball. Araminta, obsessed with marrying Rosemund well, pressured Sophie to adjust and fix their dresses to perfection. Sophie's life was summarized in serving Araminta and her daughters, without receiving a shred of recognition. However, that night would change something in Sophie's life. Mrs. Gibbons, the housekeeper, along with the other maids, had a secret plan. While Araminta, Rosemund, and Posy were heading to the ball, Mrs. Gibbons took Sophie to her room, where a steaming bath and a set of old dresses awaited her. In an act of kindness and defiance, the maids prepared Sophie for the ball. Sophie transformed into a dazzling vision. With a silver silk dress adorned with pearls and elegant gloves, she looked like a true princess. The maids bathed her, perfumed her, and styled her hair, even applying a bit of makeup. Sophie couldn't believe what she saw in the mirror. For one night, she would be the queen of the ball. Accompanied by the coachman, Sophie headed to the Bridgerton ball with instructions to return before midnight. As she climbed into the carriage, excitement and gratitude filled her heart. She would have a few hours to live a dream, an escape from the harsh reality she faced every day. The lights of the masquerade ball shone in the distance, promising a night of magic and possibilities. Sophie, now dressed like a true lady, prepared to enter a world that had always been out of her reach, knowing that those few hours would have to last a lifetime. Chapter 2. The Bridgerton family, known for their notable physical resemblance and for following a curious alphabetical order in the names of their 8 children, had a member who felt particularly uncomfortable with their collective identity. Benedict Bridgerton, the second son, found himself amidst the hustle and bustle of the masquerade ball organized by his mother. Despite wearing a black mask, everyone recognized him as a Bridgerton, making him wish to be seen more as an individual than as part of his family. As he tried to escape the crowd, Benedict encountered his mother, Violet, who asked him to dance with one of the Featherington sisters, though he preferred to avoid the less graceful ones. Determined to find a respite, he headed towards the lemonade table, but something caught his attention and made him stop. A stunning woman, whose joy and radiance stood out, captured his gaze. She was different from any other woman he had seen. Her happiness was contagious and genuine. Determined to meet her, Benedict made his way through the crowd, claiming that the lady had promised him the dance. The woman, surprised but amused, accepted. She whispered that she didn't know how to dance, and he offered to teach her. The connection between them was immediate and electrifying. However, their moment was interrupted by Colin, Benedict's brother, who scolded him for abandoning Penelope Featherington. After a brief and humorous interaction between the brothers, Colin withdrew, leaving Benedict and his mysterious lady alone again. As they walked towards a private terrace, Sophie Beckett, disguised and enjoying her dream night, felt that her life was about to change. The encounter with Benedict seemed straight out of a fairy tale, and although she knew her reality was very different, she couldn't help but feel like a princess for that night. As they conversed, they shared small personal details, and Sophie, moved by Benedict's kindness, began to open her heart. Benedict, fascinated by the mix of joy and sadness in Sophie, promised that he would do everything possible to transform her life. But Sophie, aware that her night of magic was temporary, replied that this night was already a sufficient transformation for her. The two, united by a fleeting yet intense moment, committed to making that night memorable, knowing that the next day, everything would return to normal. Chapter 3. The anticipation for the masquerade ball at the Bridgerton house had reached its peak. Amid the rumors and speculations, Lady Whistledown eagerly awaited the high society's costumes. Meanwhile, Sophie, in her splendid borrowed attire, found herself on the private terrace with Benedict, who gently and firmly guided her through a waltz. Despite Sophie's initial clumsiness, Benedict helped her find the rhythm. Handel's music softly resonated as they twirled on the small terrace, isolated from the hustle and bustle of the ballroom. The touch of their hands and the proximity of their bodies created a palpable connection. Benedict, with his delicate touch and soothing whispers, made Sophie feel safe and happy. The conversation turned more intimate when Benedict mentioned his family. Sophie, who had had a lonely childhood, compared her life to Benedict's, who was surrounded by siblings. Although she tried to maintain her mystery, Benedict, astute and observant, began to unravel details about her identity. The chemistry between them was undeniable. Benedict, with his natural charm and genuine desire to know her better, made promises of a future together. Sophie, aware of the brevity of her dream, resisted revealing her true identity. However, the intensity of the moment and the honesty in their words deepened their connection. As they danced, the music and atmosphere enveloped Sophie in a whirlwind of emotions. Benedict's kiss, soft and seductive, left her breathless and longing for more. His words, filled with tenderness and desire, promised a future Sophie knew she couldn't have. The reality of her situation as an illegitimate daughter and servant reminded her that her time with Benedict was fleeting. The sound of the gong announcing midnight broke the spell. Sophie, terrified at the possibility of being discovered, realized she had to leave immediately. With her heart pounding, she ran through the ballroom, dodging guests and avoiding Benedict's keen gaze. She managed to reach the waiting carriage and, with one last glance back, saw Benedict searching the crowd intently. Her hurried farewell and the adrenaline of the moment made Sophie feel a mix of sadness and euphoria. She knew her dream night had ended, but the memories of that perfect moment would endure in her heart. The carriage drove away, taking her back to reality, but Sophie knew that night had changed her life forever. Chapter 4. Rumors about Benedict Bridgerton and a mysterious lady at the Masquerade ball had spread quickly. Lady Whistledown, always on the lookout for juicy gossip, failed to uncover the identity of the woman in silver, increasing the mystery around her. Benedict was desperate. Since the moment the mysterious lady disappeared, he hadn't stopped thinking about her. In the hustle of the ball, Lady Danbury had detained him, and when he finally freed himself, the woman had already vanished. Standing in front of Bridgerton House, he scanned the crowd of carriages and pedestrians, but there was no trace of her. With frustration and sadness, he realized he didn't even have a clear clue about her identity, only the glove she had left behind. Desperate, Benedict examined the glove and noticed the embroidered initials and familiar crest. He thought of his mother, Violet Bridgerton, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of noble families. Wasting no time, he went home and showed the glove to Violet. She identified the crest as belonging to the Penwood family and suggested that the glove might have belonged to Sarah Louisa Gunningworth, the late Earl's mother. While Benedict tried to gather more information, Sophie was dealing with the harsh reality of her life. After the magical night at the ball, she had returned to her role as a servant, removing the borrowed dress, makeup, and shoes, returning everything to its original place. Araminta's reprimand for the scratched shoes quickly brought her back to reality. Araminta, furious and suspecting someone had used her shoes, took out her frustration on Sophie, ordering her to clean all her shoes as punishment. Sophie, resigned, went up to comply with the order. As she cleaned the shoes, her mind wandered back to the previous night, recalling every moment with Benedict, every glance, and every word. The brief fantasy of being someone else, even for just one night, had been enough to keep a spark of hope alive in her heart. Meanwhile, Benedict was determined to find the woman who had captured his heart. With Penwood House's address in hand, he headed there in hopes of discovering more about the late Earl's stepdaughters. Before leaving, his mother, with a mix of curiosity and hope, reminded him to tell her what he found. Benedict, with renewed determination, went out in search of answers. Upon arriving at Penwood House, Benedict was greeted by the butler and led to see the Dowager Countess. As he waited, his mind was full of thoughts about the mysterious woman. Could it be Rosemund or Posey? Neither name seemed to fit the image he had of her, but he had no choice but to investigate. At Penwood House, Araminta was surprised by Benedict Bridgerton's visit. She immediately rushed to order tea and cookies, eager to impress such a distinguished visitor. Sophie, from upstairs, heard the preparations and wondered what was happening. However, her mind remained occupied with Araminta's orders and the tedious task of cleaning the shoes. Benedict, prepared to face any challenge, entered Penwood House, determined to find the woman who had transformed his night and his heart. Meanwhile, Sophie, trapped in her role as a servant, prepared to face another long day, unaware that the man who had touched her soul was closer than she imagined. Chapter 5. London's high society was still buzzing about the Masquerade ball, and Lady Whistledown wasted no time commenting on the disastrous costumes of the Featheringtons and Posy Riling's failed attempt to look like a mermaid. However, the focus remained on the identity of the mysterious lady who had caught Benedict Bridgerton's interest. Benedict was obsessed with the glove she had left behind. While waiting at Lady Penwood's house, he constantly checked the pocket of his jacket, ensuring the glove was still there. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the silver dress. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Penwood, whom he greeted courteously. She wasted no time mentioning that she had informed her daughters of his presence and that they would be down to meet him. Benedict, trying to hide his impatience, was delighted by the opportunity to meet Rosemund and Posy, though he was sure neither was the woman he sought. Lady Penwood, however, was thrilled to have a Bridgerton in her home, which was evident from her effusive smiles and comments about her daughter's qualities. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a maid with the tea service, and Benedict seized the chance to change the subject and avoid discussing the servants, though he couldn't help a pang of compassion for the mentioned Sophie, who was clearly unappreciated by Lady Penwood. The introductions to Rosemund and Posy yielded no clues about the identity of his mysterious lady, but Benedict tried to hide his disappointment. After a brief chat, he decided he would not get any more information and took his leave, leaving Lady Penwood and her daughters with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Araminta was furious. The fact that Benedict had not shown interest in her daughters deeply irritated her. After Benedict's departure, Araminta turned to Rosemund and Posy, trying to discover what had motivated the young Bridgertons' visit. Looking out the window, she saw Benedict examining the glove and realized he was searching for the woman in the silver dress. She immediately connected the visit to the scratched shoes and concluded that Sophie had attended the ball. In a fit of rage, Araminta rushed upstairs to the closet where Sophie was cleaning the shoes. She ordered her to pack her things and leave the house at dawn, leaving Sophie speechless and in tears. Sophie couldn't believe what was happening. With nowhere to go, she felt trapped and scared. She recalled the happy moments of her childhood, but those memories only increased her sadness. Araminta showed no mercy and reminded her of her status as a bastard, ordering her to finish cleaning all the shoes before leaving. With silent resignation, Sophie set out to complete the task, knowing her life would change forever. She spent the night awake, planning her uncertain future and contemplating her limited options. In the end, she decided that the only way to survive was to leave London. The next morning, with Posy's help, Sophie packed her few belongings and left Penwood House without looking back, knowing her future would be uncertain but free from Araminta's oppression. Second part, Chapter 6. 3 years have passed since there was a wedding in the Bridgerton family, and Lady Bridgerton is starting to despair. Benedict, at 30 years old, still hasn't looked for a bride. Colin, at 26, hasn't shown interest either, although his youth might excuse his tardiness. Lady Bridgerton's concerns also include her daughters Eloise and Francesca, who, despite receiving proposals, have yet to show any inclination towards marriage. However, Lady Whistledown believes there is no real cause for worry, as it is inconceivable that the Bridgertons won't make acceptable matches in due time. Benedict Bridgerton, at a party hosted by Philip Cavender, felt out of place. The party was full of alcohol, cigars, and high-stakes gambling, things he once enjoyed but now found tedious. After unsuccessfully searching for his host to say goodbye, he decided to leave. Just as he was about to go, he saw Philip and his friends harassing a young maid. The situation forced him to intervene, despite his reluctance to play the hero. The maid, Sophie Beckett, had worked for the Cavenders for almost 2 years after fleeing Penwood House. Life had slightly improved until Philip returned and began harassing her. When the Cavenders left for a visit to Brighton, Philip threw a party, and Sophie became his target. She finally decided to leave to avoid a worse fate. However, Philip found her as she was escaping and subjected her to the humiliation of being groped by him and his friends. Benedict intervened just in time, confronting Philip and his friends. He demanded they release Sophie, and though there was initial resistance, Benedict's authority prevailed. He promised to find her a job in his mother's house, leaving Sophie speechless. She accepted the offer with a simple nod, knowing it was her only option to escape Philip. As they walked towards Benedict's carriage, Sophie hoped he would recognize her. However, he showed no signs of recognition. 2 years ago, at the Masquerade ball, she had worn a mask and had her hair powdered and long. Now, with short hair and her face exposed, it seemed Benedict did not realize who she was. This realization left Sophie in a state of confusion, unsure whether to laugh or cry at the fact that the man who had once been her Prince Charming didn't recognize her. Chapter 7. At the recent Mottram party, it became clear that Rosemund Riling had set her sights on Philip Cavender. Lady Whistledown opines that they actually make a good pair. 10 minutes after being rescued, Sophie Beckett found herself sitting next to Benedict Bridgerton in his carriage. Benedict, concerned about her apparent confusion, asked if something had gotten into her eye. Sophie, trying to control her nervous laughter, responded that she was fine. As they continued their journey, Sophie thought about the irony that Benedict did not recognize her after dreaming of this moment for 2 years. He, however, had no idea who she was. Benedict tried to start a conversation, but Sophie remained cautious. He mentioned that he had 4 sisters, which made him more sensitive to her situation. Sophie, for her part, tried not to reveal too much about her past. When he commented that she had a refined diction for a maid, she explained that she had attended lessons with the daughters of the family she worked for. Their journey took them to Benedict's country cottage, where they would spend the night before heading to his mother's house. Sophie, surprised by the situation, prepared for whatever might come. Benedict mentioned they would be accompanied by the caretakers, the Crabtrees, but upon arrival, they found the house empty. As they sat in the carriage, it began to rain heavily. Benedict, who had been suffering from a cold, started coughing violently, which worried Sophie. She decided to drive the carriage herself, despite Benedict's initial reluctance. They arrived soaked and shivering with cold, but the experience allowed them to share a moment of closeness. Upon reaching the house, Benedict looked for the spare key, as the caretakers were not there. Once inside, Sophie was concerned about being alone with him, but Benedict, between bouts of coughing, insisted she had nothing to worry about. Sophie tried to find a room for the servants, but Benedict refused, assuring her she wouldn't be left alone. This unexpected closeness brought Sophie a mix of emotions. She cried from the fear and loneliness accumulated over the years. Benedict, seeing her so vulnerable, comforted her. Although Sophie still wished he would recognize her, she understood that it was better if he didn't know who she really was. Finally, visibly exhausted and ill, Benedict made it clear she would not be left alone. His determination to protect her reinforced Sophie's admiration for him, despite the confusion and circumstances. The night promised to be long and complicated, but for the first time in a long time, Sophie didn't feel completely alone. Chapter 8. Lady Whistledown commented in her column about the constant complaint of London's high society regarding the lack of good domestic service. She particularly mentioned an altercation between Lady Penwood and Mrs. Featherington over a maid who had returned to Mrs. Featherington after realizing the harsh conditions imposed by Lady Penwood. Benedict Bridgerton, with a persistent and debilitating cough, insisted that they both warm up by the fire before going to bed. Sophie, worried about his condition, helped him light the fire. Once the flames began to warm the room, Benedict suggested finding dry clothes, and although Sophie tried to argue, he remained firm in his decision not to let her sleep in a servant's room. They went upstairs, and Sophie found herself choosing a small guest room, following Benedict's instructions on which not to choose, as that was his. While lighting the stove in Benedict's bedroom, she felt intrigued by the personal items scattered around the room, but she didn't have much time to explore before he entered. Benedict, looking pale and sick, needed to remove his wet clothes. Sophie, although uncomfortable, helped him unbutton his shirt and made sure he lay down. With a weak smile, Benedict tried to keep his spirits up but quickly fell asleep. Sophie, full of nervous energy, changed into dry clothes and lit the stove in her own room. But soon, she was awakened by Benedict's groans. Entering his room, she found him feverish and delirious. She quickly took clean sheets and water to try to bring down his fever. Despite her fear and nerves, she managed to change the sheets and moisten his forehead to ease his discomfort. During the night, Sophie explored Benedict's personal items, including a sketchbook full of landscapes and portraits. To her surprise, she found a drawing of herself at the Masquerade ball, which deeply moved her. Returning to his side, she found Benedict delirious, asking her to kiss him, which she did tenderly. Benedict seemed to be slightly improving, though still feverish. Sophie promised him he would feel better in the morning, and although he doubted it, she remained firm in her reassurance, ensuring him that everything would be fine. Chapter 9. Lady Whistledown noted that men are the worst patients, incapable of maintaining the patience needed to recover. At dawn, Sophie woke from an uncomfortable sleep in Benedict's room, startled by the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Crabtree, the caretakers of my cottage. After a brief and confusing introduction, Benedict himself intervened, confirming that Sophie had been taking care of him while he was sick. Mrs. Crabtree offered to prepare tea and breakfast for everyone, insisting that Sophie also receive her share. Meanwhile, Benedict, though weakened by fever and cough, managed to joke with Mr. Crabtree about Mrs. Crabtree's strict and authoritative nature. During breakfast, Sophie tried to explain her presence at Philip Cavender's party, clarifying that she had been a maid in the house. However, the details of her condition and attire, wearing borrowed clothes from Benedict, raised more questions from the Crabtrees. Mrs. Crabtree decided to lend Sophie a suitable dress while her wet clothes were cleaned. Benedict, despite his discomfort, continued to show concern and tenderness towards Sophie. Mrs. Crabtree, impressed by Sophie, even suggested keeping her as help in the house. The relaxed and welcoming atmosphere allowed Sophie to enjoy a hearty breakfast, while Benedict watched her with a mix of admiration and concern. During the conversation, Sophie revealed she hadn't eaten all day the previous day, which enraged Benedict, who was determined to protect her. The connection between them became more evident, strengthened by the fact that they had cared for each other in moments of vulnerability. Benedict once again offered to find her a position in his mother's house, but Sophie preferred to stay in the countryside. Although Sophie tried to maintain her independence, Benedict insisted on helping her, showing his desire to care for and protect her. Finally, in an exchange of jokes, Sophie, overwhelmed by the situation, threw a candle stub at Benedict impulsively. To her surprise, he took it with humor, provoking a genuine smile from her, a sign of their growing complicity and affection. Chapter 10. Benedict Bridgerton, despite accepting the invitation to the Covingtons' annual ball, did not attend, to the great disappointment of many young ladies and their mothers. Lady Bridgerton, more annoyed than worried, mentioned that her son had gone to the countryside and nothing had been heard of him since. In his convalescence, Benedict found that a restful life had its advantages. He enjoyed Mrs. Crabtree's excellent food and the brandy Mr. Crabtree used to replace his wife's tonic. Additionally, he had the opportunity to enjoy tranquility, read, and draw without feeling guilty for neglecting other duties. However, the greatest pleasure was Sophie's company. She visited him several times a day, either to attend to him or simply to chat. Although initially reserved, Benedict managed to engage her in conversation, enjoying her company and finding peace in her presence. One afternoon, Sophie brought him tea and cookies, and Benedict invited her to join him. Although she hesitated, she eventually agreed. As they chatted, Sophie mentioned she had been helping Mrs. Crabtree in the kitchen and then read a romance novel in the garden. Watching her, Benedict realized he desired her with an urgency he had never experienced before. Trying to hide his growing desire, Benedict asked Sophie to read him some poetry. However, as he focused on her lips while she read, his desire intensified, and he decided he needed to be alone to calm himself. Sophie, thinking he needed privacy, offered to leave, and Benedict, feeling guilty for hurting her feelings, explained that he needed to be alone for a moment. Once alone, Benedict quickly dressed and escaped through the window to head to the lake, where he planned to take a cold bath to calm his thoughts. Meanwhile, Sophie, confused by Benedict's behavior, decided to go downstairs. Mrs. Crabtree commented that she hadn't seen Benedict in his room, which worried Sophie. Suspecting that Benedict wasn't really sick, Sophie decided to go for a walk and enjoy the fresh air. During her walk, Sophie remembered that Benedict had mentioned a nearby lagoon and decided to head there. Upon arrival, she heard splashing sounds and, with curiosity and fear, hid behind a tree to observe. Peeking out, she saw a naked man in the water, and to her surprise, it was Benedict. Chapter 11. Disputes over domestic staff were at their peak in London. Lady Penwood publicly insulted Mrs. Featherington, calling her a low-born thief. Mrs. Featherington responded disdainfully, criticizing Lady Penwood's management of her maid, revealing that the young woman named Estelle was not French but a girl from Liverpool named Bess. The altercation ended when Lady Penwood stormed off in a fury, dragging her daughter Posy, who tried to apologize with her eyes. Lady Whistledown predicted that the Penwoods would not be welcome at Mrs. Featherington's next party. Sophie knew it was wrong to stay there, spying on Benedict, but she couldn't help it. She had found a hidden spot from where she watched him in the water, submerged up to his chest. It was a tempting sight, and Sophie, though ashamed, couldn't look away. Benedict, meanwhile, was experiencing a familiar sensation of premonition. He remembered feeling something similar the day his father died and the night of the masquerade ball when he met her. Now, submerged in the lake, he felt that something important was about to happen. His instincts didn't fail him. Someone was nearby. Then he shouted Sophie's name. Sophie, surprised and embarrassed, had no choice but to step out of her hiding place. Benedict, however, didn't seem angry, just intrigued. He ordered her to turn around while he dressed, and though she protested, she reluctantly obeyed. When she finally turned back, she found him fully dressed, though still wet. Benedict confronted her, asking what she was doing there. Sophie, trying to maintain her composure, explained she was taking a walk. However, Benedict, with a mix of irony and charm, accused her of spying on him, something she couldn't completely deny. Despite everything, he didn't seem angry, rather amused and flattered by the situation. The conversation quickly became more intense. Benedict, aware of his feelings, approached Sophie, confessing that he had to kiss her. She, despite her reservations, couldn't resist and accepted the kiss. It was a magical moment that transported her back to the night of the masquerade ball. Benedict, feeling a deep connection with Sophie, asked her to stay with him in London, offering her his heart and promising to give her everything she desired. Sophie, surprised by the offer and overwhelmed by her own feelings, found herself at a crossroads, facing the possibility of a love she never thought could be real. Chapter 12. Speculations about Benedict Bridgerton's disappearance continued to abound. Eloise Bridgerton, his sister, had mentioned that he should have returned to the city several days ago, but it seemed Benedict didn't feel the need to inform his younger sister of his whereabouts. Sophie, confronting Benedict, painfully understood that he wanted her to be his mistress. His insistence and the intensity of his kisses made her waver, but Sophie knew she couldn't give in. Her morality and fear of an uncertain future, especially if she became pregnant, prevented her from accepting Benedict's offer, no matter how tempting it was. She refused to be his lover, preferring to maintain her dignity and morals intact, even if it meant returning to a life of servitude. Benedict, frustrated and hurt by Sophie's refusal, tried to convince her with promises of luxury and protection, but Sophie stood firm. Despite Benedict's desire to keep her safe, Sophie couldn't accept a life as his mistress. The argument escalated, pushing both to a breaking point. Sophie refused to yield to Benedict's demands, and he, in a fit of desperation, threatened to accuse her of theft to keep her close. Finally, Benedict gave her an ultimatum: go to London with him and work in his mother's house, or face false charges of theft. Sophie, caught between a rock and a hard place, was forced to accept the first option. Though she knew she would hate Benedict for forcing her to make that decision, he preferred living with her hatred to losing her completely. The tension between them was palpable, and although Sophie agreed to go to London, both knew the road ahead would be complicated and full of challenges. Benedict, determined not to lose Sophie, prepared to take her to London, hoping that time and proximity could change their relationship for the better. Chapter 13. Lady Whistledown's column denied rumors of a possible engagement between Miss Rosemund Riling and Mr. Philip Cavender. Lady Penwood, Miss Riling's mother, rejected the idea of a son-in-law without a title, and to add to the tension, Mr. Cavender had shown interest in Miss Cressida Cooper. Meanwhile, Sophie and Benedict arrived in London. During the journey, Sophie felt a mix of anxiety and apprehension, knowing Araminta was in the city. Her tension increased as they approached London, remembering that the social season was in full swing. The journey ended in front of a house unknown to Sophie. Benedict revealed that his mother, Violet Bridgerton, had left Bridgerton House to live in a smaller residence. Still confused, Sophie tried to maintain her distance, insisting on entering through the service entrance like a proper maid. But Benedict, relentless, forced her to enter through the front door, defying social conventions. Inside, they were greeted by the butler, Wickham, who showed slight disapproval at Sophie's presence. Benedict asked Wickham to inform his mother of their arrival and Sophie's. Violet Bridgerton, a petite and elegant woman, soon appeared and, after some explanations from Benedict, agreed to consider hiring Sophie as a maid. Violet, with her keen perception, noticed something familiar about Sophie, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. Benedict explained that Sophie had cared for him while he was sick, which piqued Violet's curiosity. Despite initial reservations, Violet showed a willingness to find a position for Sophie, impressed by her education and refined manners. During the conversation, Sophie bitterly recalled her dreams of a better life and the opportunities she never had. While Violet took her to meet her daughters and offered her new clothes, Sophie was touched by Violet's kindness and the family atmosphere of the Bridgerton household. Although Sophie knew she was starting a new job, she couldn't help but feel she was also entering a new family, something that brought an unexpected and pleasant sense of belonging and hope. Chapter 14. Rosemund Riling claimed to have seen Benedict Bridgerton back in London. Lady Whistledown, with her unmistakable sarcasm, suggested that Miss Riling had a special knack for detecting bachelors from afar, though she had unfortunately not been successful in catching any. Benedict had just begun to relax in the sitting room when his sister Eloise came running in. With her characteristic brown hair and bright green eyes, Eloise exuded the same energy as the rest of the Bridgerton family. After a sarcastic exchange about the lack of news in the city and the monotony of high society, Eloise quickly broached the subject of Benedict's recent disappearance. He explained that he had been recovering from a cold at my cottage, something Eloise found rather unusual and concerning. The conversation between the siblings revealed the recent addition of Sophie as a maid in the Bridgerton household. Benedict explained how Sophie had cared for him while he was ill. Eloise, always curious and direct, decided to go meet the new maid, leaving Benedict with a brief respite before his mother, Violet, entered the room. Violet, with her sharp intuition, quickly noticed that Sophie was not an ordinary maid. She suspected that Sophie might be of noble origin or, at the very least, have received an unusually good education for someone of her position. Benedict, though sharing some of these suspicions, defended Sophie, acknowledging that there was something special about her. In her room, Sophie tried not to feel too comfortable in the beautiful Bridgerton house, aware that her stay couldn't be permanent. However, the kindness of Violet and the feeling of temporary belonging made her wish otherwise. Despite the risks of encountering Araminta and the complications of her relationship with Benedict, Sophie found solace in the warmth of the Bridgerton family. Violet's arrival in her room marked the beginning of a series of questions that Sophie answered with her fabricated story. Although surprised by Violet's interest in her past, Sophie maintained her composure. The conversation was interrupted by Eloise, who entered, curious to meet the new maid. Eloise, with her keen perception, soon discovered that Sophie had something special. Despite initial tensions, Eloise accepted Sophie and included her in her circle with a sly smile that showed approval. Sophie, for her part, felt a mix of amazement and gratitude for the way she was treated, as if she were more than just a maid. Although she knew her situation was temporary, Sophie couldn't help but dream of the possibility of being part of the Bridgerton family, at least as a friend. The warmth and acceptance she found in them gave her a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in a long time, making her wonder if, perhaps, her life was just beginning. Chapter 15. Lady Whistledown reported with her unmistakable sarcasm about the comings and goings of domestic staff between Lady Penwood's and Mrs. Featherington's houses. Apparently, a maid from the Bridgerton daughters had defected to Penwood House, only to be replaced by one who had returned running to the Featheringtons after being forced to clean 300 pairs of shoes. In other news, she confirmed that Benedict Bridgerton was back in London after an illness. The next morning, Sophie met 5 of Benedict's siblings. Eloise, Francesca, and Hyacinth lived with their mother. Anthony had come for breakfast with his youngest son, and Daphne, the Duchess of Hastings, had come to help plan the end-of-season ball. She had yet to meet Gregory, who was at Eton, and Colin, who was traveling. Benedict appeared that morning for breakfast, and Sophie encountered him in the hallway as she headed to the kitchen. Although she tried to avoid him, he managed to block her path, asking how her first night in the Bridgerton house had been. The interaction, filled with awkward tension and evident flirtation, left Sophie anxious. Later, Benedict surprised her in the garden while she was reading. Despite her attempts to ignore him, Benedict's presence was impossible to ignore. He challenged her, suggesting that her life didn't have to be boring. The tension between them increased when Benedict insinuated that her secrets were consuming her. Although Sophie tried to keep her distance, the desire between them was palpable. Benedict, unable to contain his frustration and desire, whispered passionate words and kissed her, vowing to make her his mistress. Sophie, caught between duty and desire, couldn't resist his advances. But when he realized they were in a public place, he restrained himself, promising to win her over without compromising her integrity. Sophie, shocked by the intensity of the encounter, was left with a mix of contradictory emotions. Although she knew she shouldn't get involved with Benedict, the longing and tenderness he awakened in her were impossible to ignore. Despite her promises to resist, Sophie's heart was deeply intertwined with Benedict's. Chapter 16. Lady Whistledown reported that the Featheringtons hosted a successful dinner, though without the presence of Benedict and Colin Bridgerton, who sent their excuses. As days turned into weeks, Sophie kept busy working for the Bridgertons. Her tasks included hairdressing, mending clothes, and ironing, filling her days with activity. The Bridgerton house was very different from Araminta's, with constant laughter and smiles. During informal tea times, Sophie was always invited to join, giving her a pleasant respite and a sense of belonging. One afternoon, Eloise asked about Benedict's whereabouts, causing Sophie to prick her finger, attracting everyone's attention. Benedict appeared then, causing a nervous reaction in Sophie. Trying to escape the situation, she stood up, saying she needed a thimble. Benedict followed her into the corridor, where she lied, saying she was going to buy one. As she left the house, Sophie saw Araminta and hid, hoping not to be seen. Although Posey recognized her, she didn't give her away, and Sophie remained still until the threat passed. Benedict found her trembling outside and took her to his nearby house to calm down. Inside, they talked about the Bridgerton family and their impact on Benedict. Sophie revealed that she admired the family and wished to have one like them. Benedict, surprised by her words, realized she saw beyond the surface and appreciated his true self. The conversation became more intimate, and Sophie acknowledged Benedict's artistic talent. Their mutual admiration and shared vulnerability drew Benedict closer to her. He realized that he loved her and that his desire to be with her went beyond the physical. The moment culminated when Benedict, moved by a mix of love and need, decided to kiss her, acknowledging that he needed her in his life in every possible way. Chapter 17. Lady Whistledown reported that Lady Penwood was struck on the head by a flying cookie while having tea at Gunter's. Although the culprit hasn't been identified, suspicion falls on young Felicity Featherington and Hyacinth Bridgerton. For Sophie, Benedict's previous kisses hadn't prepared her for the intensity of this one. This kiss wasn't just a kiss. It was heaven itself. Benedict kissed her with overwhelming passion, whispering her name and gently unbuttoning her dress, revealing her skin and making her moan with desire. Benedict was equally affected, surprised by the primal need he felt for Sophie. He caressed, kissed, and desired her like never before. With each touch and kiss, he ensured she felt loved and desired. As they continued their encounter, Sophie felt overwhelmed by the mix of emotions and new sensations. Benedict made sure she enjoyed every moment, being tender and patient. When they were finally united, Sophie experienced indescribable pleasure, and they both reached an intense and shared release. Afterwards, Benedict dressed while Sophie, covered by a blanket, processed what had just happened. Although she was happy, she was also aware of the implications of their act. When Benedict mentioned sending someone for her things, Sophie realized he expected her to become his mistress. Sophie rejected the idea, knowing she couldn't live as his lover due to her own history of illegitimacy. Although she loved him, she couldn't bear the thought of having an illegitimate child. Sophie explained her reasons, revealing her pain and fears. Benedict tried to persuade her, but finally understood the depth of her feelings. In the end, Sophie asked him to leave, and when he left, she collapsed on the sofa, crying over the complexity of her emotions and the difficult decision she had made. Chapter 18. Lady Whistledown observed that the supply of eligible bachelors this season was scarce, especially after the marriages of the Duke of Ashbourne and the Earl of Macclesfield. The single Bridgerton brothers, Benedict and Colin, were also notably absent. Colin was out of town, possibly in Wales or Scotland, while Benedict avoided social gatherings. Sophie hadn't seen Benedict for 2 weeks, feeling lost and broken inside. Although she was sure rejecting Benedict's proposal was the right thing to do, the pain of separation was unbearable. Additionally, the fear of being discovered by Posey and the constant emotional pressure made it difficult for her to leave the house and face daily life. One afternoon, as Sophie was heading to her room to work, Lady Bridgerton stopped her and asked why she hadn't been joining the family for tea. Sophie, trying to avoid gatherings where she inevitably thought of Benedict, mentioned being busy with mending. However, Lady Bridgerton insisted she join them, leading her to the sitting room where all the Bridgerton daughters and the Duchess of Hastings, Daphne, were gathered. Hyacinth mentioned that Benedict had been absent, causing Sophie to prick her finger upon hearing his name. She tried to maintain her composure as the Bridgertons discussed Benedict, his absence, and his talents. Sophie, defending Benedict's artistic talent, revealed her knowledge about him, which surprised the family. The conversation continued when Penelope Featherington, a friend of Eloise, arrived at the gathering. Penelope seemed to recognize Sophie, although she couldn't recall from where. Nervous about being discovered, Sophie excused herself, saying she didn't feel well, and left quickly. Meanwhile, Benedict was heading to his mother's house, immersed in his foul mood. Upon meeting his brothers Anthony and Colin, he realized he couldn't avoid discussing his broken heart. Colin, recently returned from Wales, confessed to escaping his mother's matchmaking attempts, who wanted to pair him with Penelope Featherington. Just then, Penelope appeared and overheard the conversation, feeling hurt by Colin's words. Although Colin tried to apologize, Penelope left, accompanied by Anthony. Colin, embarrassed, stayed with Benedict as their mother invited them to tea to discuss a charming young woman. Benedict, resigned, accepted, feeling as if he were on his way to the gallows. Chapter 19. At the last musical soiree hosted by her mother, Posy Riling, the younger stepdaughter of the late Earl of Penwood, behaved strangely, spending the entire evening looking out the window as if expecting someone. After 45 minutes of listening to his mother talk about potential brides, Benedict was on the brink of despair. Violet, his mother, spoke of several young ladies, none of whom interested Benedict. As his mother spoke, he thought about his own romantic dilemma and finally asked Violet about her love for his late father. Violet shared how she immediately knew he was the love of her life and how their love was deep and true. This conversation made Benedict reflect on his own love for Sophie and how, despite social barriers, his love for her was the most important thing. Meanwhile, Sophie was exhausted from looking after the Bridgerton cousins. Nicholas, Elizabeth, John, and Alice were a whirlwind of energy, and Sophie struggled to maintain order and peace among them. Hyacinth, the youngest of the Bridgertons, was also present and, together with Sophie, tried to control the children. Finally, Sophie suggested playing blind man's buff, volunteering to be it. Benedict, trying to escape the house unnoticed, was intercepted by his sister Eloise, who reminded him of his promise to help Hyacinth with arithmetic. Resigned, Benedict went up to the nursery, where he found Sophie blindfolded, playing with the children. The sight of Sophie blindfolded reminded him of the lady at the Masquerade ball, and suddenly he realized that Sophie and the lady in the silver dress were the same person. Filled with rage and pain from the revelation, Benedict ordered the children and Hyacinth to leave, leaving Sophie alone with him. In an intense confrontation, Benedict asked Sophie why she hadn't told him the truth. Sophie, still blindfolded, confessed that she hadn't thought her identity was relevant and didn't want him to find her. The argument turned bitter when Sophie revealed that she was the illegitimate daughter of the Earl of Penwood. Feeling betrayed and hurt, Benedict decided he couldn't stay with her any longer at that moment and stormed out of the room. Chapter 20. The Countess of Penwood, Araminta Riling, had shown strange behavior in recent days. According to the servants, she had a tantrum the previous night, throwing 17 shoes at her servants and injuring a footman. After her intense confrontation with Benedict, Sophie decided she couldn't stay in the Bridgerton house. She packed her few belongings and, with a broken heart, went to Lady Bridgerton's office to resign. Although the Dowager Viscountess offered to let her stay, Sophie felt compelled to leave, feeling her presence was no longer welcome after the altercation with Benedict. Lady Bridgerton, with a mix of sadness and understanding, offered Sophie some money and a carriage for her journey, worried about her safety. Sophie reluctantly accepted, and while waiting for the carriage in the foyer, decided to step outside for some fresh air. Outside, fate caught up with her in the form of Araminta, who saw her and started screaming for help. Sophie tried to run but was caught by a man who tackled her to the ground. Araminta, full of malice, seized the opportunity to accuse Sophie of theft and demand her arrest. Within minutes, the authorities arrived, and without giving Sophie a chance to explain or anyone from the Bridgerton house to defend her, she was taken to jail. Sophie, with her heart full of despair, could only think that the Bridgertons would never know what had happened to her. Perhaps she thought that was for the best for everyone. Chapter 21. The previous afternoon had brought a series of surprising events at Lady Bridgerton's residence. First, Penelope Featherington had been seen in the company of 3 Bridgerton brothers, a notable achievement for someone considered the ugly duckling of the ball. However, her companion at the end of the evening was the Viscount, the only married brother of the group. But what really shook the family was the incident involving Araminta Riling, the Countess of Penwood. Araminta had Sophie Beckett arrested, accusing her of theft, a fact that caused a great stir in the neighborhood and was quickly picked up by Lady Whistledown. The next morning, Benedict was in a terrible mood. His confrontation with Sophie had left him bewildered and furious. He decided to practice fencing with his brother Colin to try to clear his mind. As they sparred, Colin noticed Benedict's foul mood and, through a conversation between thrusts, made him see that he should marry Sophie, regardless of social barriers. Benedict, still angry, realized he loved Sophie and was willing to overcome any obstacle for her. However, upon returning home, he discovered that Sophie had left the Bridgerton residence. Lady Bridgerton explained that Sophie had insisted on leaving, despite her efforts to make her stay and ensure a safe journey. As they discussed what to do, Francesca and Hyacinth burst in with the latest edition of Whistledown, informing them that Sophie had been arrested. Benedict, without wasting time, decided to go to the jail to free Sophie. Despite his initial resistance to take his mother, Lady Bridgerton insisted on accompanying him, convinced that her presence could help prove Sophie's innocence. Together, they left quickly, determined to save Sophie from her unjust imprisonment. Chapter 22. Friday morning on Bruton Street was filled with unusual commotion. The Dowager Viscountess Bridgerton and her son Benedict rushed out of their house, clearly on an urgent mission. At the same time, the Penwood household was in chaos, with a public argument between the Countess and her daughter Posy. In a cold prison cell, Sophie Beckett faced loneliness and misery. She reflected on her life while enduring the harsh conditions and rats. Suddenly, the arrival of an unexpected visitor interrupted her thoughts. Araminta, the Countess of Penwood, approached her cell, reveling in Sophie's suffering. Araminta falsely accused her of theft and maliciously predicted her deportation. The confrontation between Sophie and Araminta was interrupted by the arrival of Benedict, accompanied by his mother, Lady Bridgerton. Furious, Benedict demanded to know the charges against Sophie. Araminta, haughty, insisted on her accusations, but Lady Bridgerton expressed her distrust of the Countess. The situation escalated when Posy arrived and confessed that she had been the one who took the shoe clips, not Sophie. The magistrate arrived to restore order, and Benedict declared that Sophie was his fiancée, surprising everyone, including Sophie. Lady Bridgerton supported her son's declaration, increasing the pressure on Araminta. The Countess, defiant, insisted on her lies, but Posy contradicted her, revealing that the wedding ring had never been stolen and that Sophie was entitled to a dowry that Araminta had embezzled. The magistrate, clearly overwhelmed by the revelations, decided to release Sophie. The atmosphere was filled with tension as the truths came to light. Araminta was exposed for her actions, and Sophie, though still facing an uncertain future, found comfort in the support of Benedict and the Bridgertons. Posy's actions, defying her mother to save Sophie, demonstrated an act of bravery and solidarity. Lady Bridgerton, always a figure of moral authority, ensured that Araminta would face the consequences of her actions. Sophie, finally, felt valued and supported, facing the future with renewed hope for justice and love. Chapter 23. The chaos on Bruton Street continued, and news of the departure of the Bridgerton and Penwood ladies caused a stir in society. Meanwhile, Benedict couldn't help but admire his mother Violet's firmness in confronting Lady Penwood in the jail. Violet, with a controlled smile, negotiated with the magistrate and put Araminta against the wall, suggesting that if she didn't agree to the story about Sophie, lawyers would investigate the disappearance of the dowry that rightfully belonged to her. Finally, Araminta conceded, agreeing to whatever story the Bridgertons decided to tell, while Posy decided to accompany the Bridgerton family, defying her mother. Araminta left in a fury, abandoning her daughter. Violet, with her wit and determination, managed to protect both Sophie and Posy, ensuring a brighter future for both. Meanwhile, Benedict, deeply grateful, confessed his love to Sophie, promising her marriage and a future together. Back at Benedict's house, Sophie and he shared an intimate moment, reaffirming their love and commitment. Benedict, full of love and admiration, offered her a bath, and as he cared for her, they shared words of love and promises of a future together. Sophie, still with doubts, finally accepted to stay with him. Later, in bed, they shared an honest conversation about their feelings and the decisions that had brought them to that moment. Sophie explained her reasons for not revealing her identity earlier, and Benedict, moved, forgave her, reaffirming his love and commitment. Sophie, emotional and relieved, surrendered to Benedict's love, confident that together, they would face any challenge. The night passed in an atmosphere of tenderness and passion, solidifying their union and preparing the way for a future together. Epilogue. At a splendid celebration at Bridgerton House, friends and family gathered to celebrate the Dowager Viscountess's birthday. The exact age of Lady Bridgerton remained a mystery, carefully guarded by Lady Whistledown's discreet pen. Meanwhile, Sophie ran playfully through the garden, chased by Benedict. After 3 children and 7 years of marriage, they still shared laughter and moments of mischief. Francesca took care of the children and also watched over Benedict's mother, ensuring them a brief moment alone. The suggestion to retire to a private terrace brought back memories of their first meeting at the Masquerade ball. A flirtatious hint and a knowing look were enough to transport them to the past. Sophie, smiling, revealed that they were expecting their 4th child, hoping this time it would be a girl. Benedict, enthusiastic, hoped his prediction would come true, though he had been wrong in the past. The conversation turned to Lady Whistledown, the enigmatic social chronicler who had revealed each of their previous pregnancies. Sophie, aware of the mentions in the magazine, shared her curiosity and amusement at the writings. Benedict, less enthusiastic, was determined to keep the next birth a secret as long as possible. The name Violet was suggested for the future daughter, in honor of Benedict's mother. Sophie, finding tenderness in the proposal, took refuge in her husband's arms, dreaming of the future. In London, Lady Whistledown wrote a new edition of her magazine, announcing the arrival of the 11th Bridgerton grandchild. However, a deep sigh and accumulated fatigue made her pause. After 11 years of recounting the lives of others, she felt it was time to live her own. With renewed determination, she looked up at the night sky, ready to embrace her own identity and new beginnings. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating literary journey. I hope you enjoyed the summary of An Offer from a Gentleman by Julia Quinn, the 3rd book in the Bridgerton series. If you liked it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next summaries. Leave me your comments and let me know what you thought of the story. What was your favorite part? I'd love to know. See you on the next literary journey. Until then, keep enjoying the magic of books. See you soon.